At 23, Kira Jackson had accepted that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially when survival meant marrying a Korean man she'd never met who everyone whispered was probably gay. The arranged marriage felt like trading one cage for another, but when her stepfather Marcus raised his fist again, even a loveless marriage in Seoul seemed like salvation. The fluorescent lights in the hotel laundry room buzzed overhead as Kira folded the endless stream of white towels, each one a reminder of the life she was desperate to escape. At 23, she should have been finishing college, maybe working her dream job as a social worker, building something meaningful. Instead, she was counting down the hours until her shift ended at the Marriott downtown, where she'd worked as a housekeeper for 2 years, saving every possible dollar while watching her mother slowly die from complications that proper medical care could fix. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Another text from her Aunt Eunice in Los Angeles, the one who'd somehow arranged this whole marriage situation through connections Kira didn't fully understand. The wedding is in 3 weeks. He's a good man, very successful. His family has money for your mother's treatment. Kira stared at the screen, then at the photos Eunice had sent weeks ago. Kim Min-jae, 35, impeccably dressed in what looked like a custom suit, standing in front of some gleaming Seoul office building. He was undeniably handsome, with sharp features and an expensive haircut, but there was something almost too perfect about his appearance, too refined, too careful. The way he stood, the way his clothes fit, the complete absence of any girlfriend in his family's social media posts. Even Eunice had mentioned, almost apologetically, that he'd never been married and seemed, well, particular about his lifestyle. Kira wasn't stupid. She'd grown up in the real world, worked alongside enough gay men in the service industry to recognize the signs. The expensive clothes, the perfect grooming, the 35-year-old Korean man whose traditional family was suddenly desperate to arrange a marriage with a Black American woman they'd never met. It painted a picture she understood all too well. Min-jae was probably closeted, under family pressure to marry for appearances, and she was the convenient solution that kept everyone's secrets safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to marry a man who might never love her because the man who was supposed to protect her had turned their home into a battlefield. Marcus Washington had seemed like a blessing when her mother brought him home 3 years ago. Steady job at the postal service, clean apartment, seemed genuinely devoted to her mom during the chemotherapy treatments. He'd even paid for Kira's first semester at community college, talking about family and building a future together. For 6 months, Kira had let herself believe they'd finally found stability. Then her mother went into remission, and Marcus started drinking more. First it was just weekends, then every night after work. The man who'd been so careful and respectful started making comments about Kira's clothes, her hours, the friends she brought around. When she got the job at the Marriott and started saving money, he'd begun checking her purse, demanding to know where every dollar went. The first time he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. Her mother had been in the kitchen making dinner. She'd seen it happen, seen the bruises the next morning, but her medical bills were still coming in and Marcus was the one with insurance. So they all pretended it hadn't happened, and Kira learned to stay in her room when he came home angry. By the time Marcus started hitting her mother during the worst of his rages, Kira knew they were trapped. Her savings account had barely $3,000, not enough to get them both out and definitely not enough to cover her mother's ongoing medical needs. Every month that passed, Marcus got bolder, meaner, more convinced that he owned them both. That's when Eunice had called with her crazy proposal. Her husband's Korean business partner had a nephew in Seoul, successful family looking for a suitable wife, willing to provide significant financial support for the right arrangement. It sounded insane, like something from a desperate romance novel, but Eunice had photos, documentation, proof that the Kim family had serious money and legitimate interest. $200,000 a year, she'd said. Full medical coverage for your mother. Education funding if you want to go back to school. All they want is a respectful wife who can help with business entertaining and family obligations. Kira had stared at the phone, doing the math. In 1 year, she could save more money than she'd make in 5 years of housekeeping. Her mother could get the surgery she needed, the treatments that might actually cure her instead of just buying time. And if Min-jae really was gay and just needed a wife for appearances, maybe it could work. They could be partners, friends even, protecting each other's secrets while building separate lives. It felt like the only choice that didn't end with her mother dead and herself permanently trapped under Marcus's control. The laundry room door swung open, startling her back to the present. Maria, the afternoon shift supervisor, poked her head in with concern written across her weathered face. "You okay, Mija? You've been folding that same towel for 5 minutes." Kira forced a smile, adding the towel to her stack. "Just thinking about things. Big changes coming up." Maria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "That bruise on your neck, it's getting darker. You sure you don't want to come stay with me and Rico for a while? Our couch is comfortable, and you know you're always welcome." The kindness in Maria's offer made Kira's throat tight with gratitude and shame. She'd gotten good at hiding the marks with makeup and scarves, but Maria noticed everything. The woman had been trying to mother her since Kira's first week on the job, bringing extra lunch and asking careful questions about her home situation. "Thank you, but I'm handling it. Actually leaving soon anyway, going to Seoul to get married." Maria's eyebrows shot up. "Seoul? Like Korea's Seoul? Girl, what are you talking about?" "Family arrangement," Kira said, which was technically true even if it left out the desperation and financial transaction aspects. "My aunt set it up. He's a good man, very successful." What was she supposed to say? That she was marrying a stranger who probably couldn't love her because it was the only way to escape a stepfather who definitely wanted to destroy her? That she was trading one form of captivity for another, hopefully gentler version? Maria studied her face with the sharp perception of someone who'd survived her own share of difficult men. "You sure about this? Marriage is hard enough when you pick them yourself." "I'm sure," Kira lied, because the alternative was staying in Detroit until Marcus's violence escalated past bruises, until her mother's health failed completely, until she lost every chance of building something better. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Eunice. It was her mother, texting from the apartment where she was supposedly resting, but probably cleaning despite Kira's warnings to take it easy. "Marcus asking when you'll be home. Says he wants to talk about soul plans. Maybe don't come straight home tonight." Kira's blood ran cold. Marcus had been increasingly agitated about the marriage plan, switching between sneering comments about her thinking she was too good for America and angry demands about what exactly she planned to tell her new husband about their family situation. Last week, he'd cornered her in the kitchen, pressing close enough that she could smell the beer on his breath, asking if she really thought some Korean pretty boy was going to take care of her better than he had. The implication had been clear. He didn't want her to leave, didn't want to lose control over the woman and money he'd grown accustomed to managing. And if she pushed too hard for independence, he'd make sure she regretted it. She texted back quickly. "Going to late shift at hotel tonight. We'll stay at Maria's and see you tomorrow." It was a lie, but a necessary one. She had enough saved for a cheap motel room, and tomorrow she'd call Eunice about moving up the wedding timeline. 3 weeks suddenly felt like too long to wait. The truth was, Kira had no idea what she was walking into in Seoul. Min Jae could be kind or cruel, gentle or controlling, genuinely gay or just emotionally unavailable. His family could welcome her or treat her like an expensive servant. The whole arrangement could fall apart within months, leaving her stranded in a foreign country with no resources and no way home. But as she folded another towel and felt the familiar ache in her ribs where Marcus had shoved her against the counter 2 nights ago, Kira knew that even an uncertain future had to be better than a present that was slowly killing both her and her mother. Her phone rang. Eunice's number. "I talked to Mrs. Kim this morning," Eunice said without preamble. "They're willing to move everything up if you're ready. Min Jae can arrange for your mother's transfer to a private facility in Los Angeles while you're getting settled, full medical coverage starting immediately. But they want you in Seoul by next Friday." Next Friday? 1 week from today? Kira closed her eyes, thinking about Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior, her mother's worried texts, the savings account that would never be enough to solve their problems. "I'll be ready," she said, and hoped she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. The black Mercedes that picked Kira up from Incheon Airport was worth more than she'd make in 3 years, and the driver spoke to her with the kind of deferential politeness usually reserved for people who owned things rather than cleaned them. As they glided through Seoul's gleaming streets toward the Gangnam district, Kira pressed her face to the tinted window and tried to process the reality that this was about to become her life. Everything about Seoul felt impossibly clean and expensive, from the towering glass buildings that reflected the afternoon sun to the perfectly manicured trees lining every boulevard. The driver, an older Korean man in an immaculate uniform, had introduced himself as Mr. Park and explained in careful English that he managed transportation for the Kim family. He'd handled her luggage like it was made of crystal rather than the battered second-hand suitcases she'd brought from Detroit, and when she tried to tip him for helping with her bags, he'd looked genuinely confused by the gesture. This is normal for them, she realized as they turned into a gated community where every house looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Money at this level wasn't flashy or new. It was simply the baseline of existence. The Kim family lived in a world where drivers and housekeepers and private security were as fundamental as electricity or running water. The Kim estate sat behind 15-foot walls topped with security cameras that tracked their car's approach with mechanical precision. The gates opened silently to reveal a circular driveway made of pale stone that led to a house that wasn't really a house so much as a compound. Traditional Korean architecture blended seamlessly with modern luxury, creating something that felt both ancient and impossibly contemporary. Gardens stretched in every direction, maintained with the kind of perfection that required a full-time staff. Kira's hands trembled slightly as she checked her reflection in the car window one more time. She'd chosen her best dress, a simple navy blue sheath she'd bought for job interviews, and spent an hour on her makeup to cover the fading bruise along her jawline where Marcus had grabbed her 3 days ago. The concealer was holding, but she felt like a fraud dressed up for a job she wasn't qualified for. Mr. Park escorted her to massive double doors made of dark wood and brass, where a woman in an elegant gray hanbok waited with the kind of serene composure Kira had only seen in museums. This was clearly Min Jae's mother, though she looked far too young and polished to have a 35-year-old son. Her English was flawless, accented but precise. "Miss Jackson, I am Mrs. Kim. Welcome to our home. We are very pleased you could join our family." The formal politeness felt surreal after years of Marcus's crude commentary and the casual chaos of her Detroit neighborhood. Mrs. Kim led her through a foyer that could have housed Kira's entire apartment, past artwork that looked like it belonged behind museum glass, into a sitting room where everything was cream silk and dark wood, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. "Please sit," Mrs. Kim said, gesturing to a sofa that probably cost more than Kira's annual salary. "Min Jae is finishing a business call, but he will join us shortly. Would you prefer tea or coffee?" "Coffee would be wonderful. Thank you." Kira settled carefully on the edge of the cushions, afraid to relax too deeply into furniture this expensive. The room smelled like jasmine and something else, something expensive and masculine that made her think of high-end department stores. Mrs. Kim poured coffee from a silver service that reflected the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens where fountains sparkled in the distance. Her movements were precise, graceful, the result of decades of practice with formal entertaining. "I want you to know that this arrangement brings us great happiness," Mrs. Kim said, handing Kira a cup of coffee served in china so delicate it was nearly transparent. "Min Jae has been very focused on business for many years. Perhaps too focused. A partnership like this will bring balance to his life and stability to our family's future." Partnership. The word felt carefully chosen, diplomatic. Not marriage, not love, not even relationship, but partnership. Kira nodded, understanding that this was as close to acknowledgement as she was likely to get that everyone involved knew this wasn't a traditional romantic union. "I understand this is a significant change for you as well," Mrs. Kim continued. "Leaving your country, your family. We hope you will find happiness here and know that you have our full support." The kindness in her voice was genuine, but Kira caught the underlying message. This was a business transaction that required discretion and mutual cooperation. Whatever Min Jae's personal situation might be, his mother was prepared to welcome Kira as long as she played her part properly. A door opened somewhere in the house, and Kira heard voices speaking rapid Korean, one of them deeper and more authoritative than the others. Mrs. Kim's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more alert. "That is Min Jae now. He has been eager to meet you." Kira set down her coffee cup with hands that had started shaking again. This was it. The moment she'd been alternately dreading and anticipating for the past week. She was about to meet the man whose name would legally become hers in 3 days, whose life she'd be sharing for the foreseeable future, whose secrets she'd be helping to protect. The sitting room door opened, and Kim Min-jae walked in. Nothing about the photographs had prepared her for the physical presence of the man. Yes, he was handsome in the sharp, expensive way she'd expected, but the pictures had somehow failed to capture the sheer intensity that seemed to radiate from him like heat. He was taller than she'd imagined, probably 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his dark suit in a way that suggested serious time in a gym. His hair was perfectly styled, his skin flawless, his features arranged with the kind of symmetrical precision that belonged in magazines. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Dark, calculating, and completely focused on her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was cataloging every detail for future reference. This wasn't the soft, artistic gaze she'd expected from a man who was probably more interested in interior design than women. This was the look of someone who was used to evaluating threats, opportunities, and assets with surgical precision. "Miss Jackson," he said, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the room. His English was perfect, unaccented, suggesting expensive international education. "I apologize for keeping you waiting. Business calls have a way of extending longer than planned." He moved across the room with controlled grace, stopping just close enough that Kira had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. When he extended his hand, she noticed the watch on his wrist, something complicated and expensive that probably cost more than her mother's medical bills. His handshake was firm, confident, the grip of someone who was accustomed to making deals and closing negotiations. "Welcome to Seoul," he said, holding her hand just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I trust the flight was comfortable and Mr. Park took good care of you." "Yes, everything was perfect. Thank you for arranging it all." Kira found herself slightly breathless, which made no sense. She'd been prepared for a pleasant, possibly effeminate man who needed a convenient wife. She hadn't been prepared for someone who looked like he could command a boardroom or a battlefield with equal effectiveness. Min-jae released her hand and moved to pour himself coffee, his movements efficient and purposeful. Everything about his body language suggested controlled power, from the way he held his shoulders to the measured pace of his steps. This wasn't someone who was pretending to be masculine for his family's benefit. This was someone who was fundamentally, undeniably alpha in every gesture. Maybe she'd been wrong about him. Maybe the lack of girlfriends and the arranged marriage had nothing to do with sexual orientation and everything to do with the kind of focused ambition that left no room for romantic complications. "I understand this situation is unusual for both of us," Min-jae said, settling into a chair across from her with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested he owned everything in sight. Which, Kira realized, he probably did. "My mother tells me you've been very gracious about the expedited timeline. I appreciate the family's flexibility, especially regarding my mother's medical care." Min-jae's expression sharpened slightly. "Yes, about that. I took the liberty of making some arrangements. There's a private facility in Los Angeles that specializes in her condition. Full medical staff, the latest treatment protocols, no waiting lists. If you approve, we can have her transferred there within the week." Kira stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. The kind of private medical care he was describing would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was talking about it like he was offering to pay for a taxi. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept something so expensive without discussing terms." Min-jae leaned forward slightly, and something in his posture made Kira suddenly aware that they were alone in this massive house with a man she didn't know at all. Not afraid, exactly, but acutely conscious of his physical presence and the power differential between them. "Miss Jackson, I think there's something we should clarify immediately. When I make arrangements for your family's welfare, I'm not offering charity. I'm investing in our partnership. Your mother's health and security directly impact your peace of mind, which directly impacts your ability to fulfill your role here. This is simply good business." The cold logic of his explanation should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Kira feel like she was being evaluated as a potentially valuable asset rather than a person. His eyes remained fixed on her face, studying her reaction with the kind of attention that suggested her response mattered more than he was letting on. "That's very practical," she said carefully. I'm a practical man, he replied. I find that clarity about expectations and capabilities prevents misunderstandings later. He paused, and his gaze dropped briefly to her hands where they rested in her lap. Kira realized with a shock of embarrassment that her concealer hadn't completely covered the finger-shaped bruises around her left wrist, faint purple marks that were still visible if someone was looking closely enough. And speaking of misunderstandings, Min Jae continued, his voice taking on a different quality, something harder and more dangerous. I assume the gentleman responsible for those marks will no longer be a factor in your life. The question was casual, almost conversational, but Kira felt the weight of serious attention behind it. This wasn't small talk. This was an interview, and her answer was going to determine something important about their future relationship. My stepfather won't be a problem, she said, which was technically true since she was now several thousand miles away from Marcus and his increasingly violent attempts to control her decisions. Good, Min Jae said simply, because I take the welfare of my household very seriously, and I have particular opinions about men who put their hands on women. The statement was delivered with the same calm efficiency he'd used to discuss his mother's medical arrangements. But something in his tone made Kira believe he wasn't talking about calling the police or filing reports. She found herself wondering exactly what kind of business Min Jae was in and what resources he had access to when dealing with problems. I appreciate that, she said, though she wasn't sure appreciation was the right word for the mixture of gratitude and unease she was feeling. Min Jae stood, straightening his jacket with movements that somehow managed to be both elegant and intimidating. I'm sure you're tired from traveling. Mrs. Choi will show you to your rooms and help you settle in. We can discuss the wedding arrangements over dinner tomorrow. He moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Miss Jackson, when I said I take the welfare of my household seriously, that extends to all forms of safety and security. If you have any concerns about anything or anyone, day or night, I expect you to bring them to my attention immediately. Yes, of course. Good. Welcome to the family, Kira. He left the room with the same controlled grace he'd entered with, leaving Kira alone with her coffee and the growing realization that she'd been completely wrong about almost everything. Min Jae wasn't gay. He wasn't soft or artistic or in need of a convenient beard. He was something far more complicated and potentially dangerous, a man with serious resources and very definite opinions about how his world should be managed. And in 3 days, she was going to become his wife. The next morning, Min Jae summoned Kira to his private office with the same efficient formality he might use to schedule any business meeting. Mrs. Choi, the elegant housekeeper who'd shown her to rooms that were larger than most apartments, delivered the message along with breakfast served on china that probably belonged in a museum. Mr. Kim would like to meet with you at 10 o'clock to discuss the partnership terms, Mrs. Choi had said in careful English. He prefers to handle important matters in his office where there are no interruptions. Now, walking through corridors lined with artwork that looked expensive enough to fund a small country's annual budget, Kira tried to prepare herself for what was essentially a job interview for the position of wife. The absurdity of it would have been funny if her mother's life hadn't been hanging in the balance. Min Jae's office occupied the entire top floor of the house's east wing, accessible through a private elevator that required a keycard to operate. The space itself was a study in controlled luxury, all dark wood and leather with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Seoul's glittering skyline. His desk was a massive piece of polished granite that looked like it could survive a nuclear strike, positioned to ensure that anyone sitting across from him would be reminded exactly who held power in any negotiation. He was standing with his back to the room when she entered, wearing another perfectly tailored suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the confident way he carried himself. His posture was relaxed but alert, like someone who was comfortable with authority but never forgot that power required vigilance. Good morning, Kira, he said without turning around. I trust you slept well. The guest suite is comfortable. It's beautiful, thank you. She settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, noting the way the morning light caught the expensive watch on his wrist and the subtle sheen of his perfectly styled hair. Everything about him radiated controlled competence, from his polished shoes to the way he moved with economic precision. I appreciate your directness yesterday about your stepfather's situation, Min-jae said, finally turning to face her. His dark eyes held hers with the kind of steady attention that made it impossible to look away. It demonstrates the kind of honesty that makes business partnerships successful. He moved to his desk and opened a folder that contained what looked like legal documents printed on heavy paper with multiple official seals. When he spoke again, his tone was the same one he might use to discuss stock portfolios or real estate acquisitions. Before we proceed with the marriage ceremony, I want to ensure we both have absolute clarity about expectations, responsibilities, and compensation. This conversation may seem unromantic, but I find that explicit agreements prevent misunderstandings that can destroy relationships. Kira nodded, though something about his clinical approach made her stomach clench with unexpected disappointment. She'd known this was a business arrangement, but hearing it stated so baldly drove home the reality that whatever attraction she might be feeling was completely one-sided. The financial terms are straightforward, Min-jae continued, sliding a document across the polished surface toward her. $200,000 annually, deposited monthly into accounts of your choosing. Full medical coverage for both you and your mother, including the specialized treatment I mentioned yesterday. Educational funding if you choose to pursue additional degrees or certifications. Housing, transportation, and household expenses managed separately. Kira stared at the numbers on the page, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering. $200,000 was more money than her family had ever dreamed of having. It was freedom from every financial stress that had defined her adult life, security for her mother's future, and resources to build whatever kind of life she wanted. That's incredibly generous, she said, though generous seemed inadequate for describing this level of life-changing support. It's proportionate to the value you'll provide, Min-jae replied. Which brings us to your responsibilities. He moved around the desk to lean against its edge, close enough that she could catch the subtle scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that reminded her of cedar and leather. The proximity was probably intended to emphasize his authority, but instead it made her acutely aware of his physical presence and the way her pulse quickened when he focused those dark eyes on her face. Publicly, you'll be my wife in all respects, he said. You'll attend business functions, family gatherings, and social events where a spouse's presence is expected. You'll learn enough about my legitimate enterprises to discuss them intelligently with partners and clients. You'll maintain the kind of appearance and demeanor that reflects well on the Kim family reputation. Kira found herself studying his face as he spoke, looking for signs of the attraction she thought she'd detected yesterday. His expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something about the way his gaze lingered on her lips when she spoke that suggested more personal interest than his words indicated. What about the private aspects of the marriage? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I want to make sure I understand all the expectations. Min-jae's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention, becoming more intense and focused. Privately, you'll live here as a member of the household with your own space and independence. I travel frequently for business, sometimes for weeks at a time. When I'm home, we'll share meals and spend time together as circumstances permit, but there are no physical obligations or expectations of intimacy. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from visibly sagging. No physical expectations meant exactly what she'd hoped it meant. Min-jae needed a wife for appearances, probably to satisfy family pressure while protecting his real romantic interests, and she needed financial security and protection. It was a perfect business arrangement that allowed them both to get what they needed without the complications of actual romance. I appreciate you being so direct about that, she said. It makes everything much clearer. Something flickered across Min-jae's features, too quick to interpret, but his voice remained level when he continued. There are also confidentiality requirements that are absolutely non-negotiable. My business involves sensitive information and relationships that require complete discretion. You'll inevitably overhear conversations, observe meetings, and become aware of activities that cannot be discussed with anyone outside this household. What kind of business, exactly? Kira asked, though she suspected she might not want to know the complete answer. Import and export operations, primarily through shipping networks that connect Seoul with major ports throughout Asia and North America. Also real estate development and strategic investments in emerging markets. The explanation sounded perfectly legitimate, but something about the way he delivered it suggested layers of complexity he wasn't sharing. Combined with the level of security around the house, the deference she'd observed from his staff, and the casual way he'd dismissed her stepfather as no longer being a problem, Kira was beginning to suspect that Min Jae's legitimate enterprises were only part of a much larger operation. "And if I violate the confidentiality requirements?" she asked. "You won't," he said with quiet certainty. "Because you understand that your mother's welfare and your own security depend on maintaining the trust that makes this partnership successful." It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't reassurance either. Min Jae was making it clear that her compliance wasn't optional, and that the consequences of betraying his trust would extend beyond just her own situation. "I understand," she said, though understanding and liking were two very different things. "Excellent." Min Jae pushed away from the desk and walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting that looked like an original Monet. When he returned, he was carrying a small velvet box that he placed on the desk between them. "There's one more element we need to address," he said, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring that caught the morning light and threw it back in prismatic flashes across the office walls. "For public appearances, you'll need appropriate jewelry that reflects your position as my wife." Kira stared at the ring, trying to estimate how many carats it contained and failing, because she'd never seen anything that large and perfect outside of museum displays. The setting was classic but substantial, clearly custom-made, and probably worth more than most people's houses. "This is for show," she said, though it came out as more of a question than a statement. "Everything about our marriage is for show," Min Jae replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested the words cost him more effort than they should have. "However, the ring is yours to keep regardless of how long the arrangement lasts. Consider it insurance for your future independence." He lifted the ring from its velvet bed and held it out toward her, waiting for her to extend her hand. When she did, his fingers brushed against hers as he slipped the diamond onto her ring finger, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the way his touch lingered just slightly longer than necessary. "Perfect fit," he said, and for a moment his voice carried a warmth that seemed to surprise them both. "How did you know my size?" Kira asked, though she was more interested in the way he was still holding her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that felt far more intimate than anything a gay man would make with his fake wife. "I'm very good at estimating measurements," he said, finally releasing her hand with what might have been reluctance. "It's a useful skill in my line of work." The ring felt heavy on her finger, substantial and warm, a tangible reminder that in 48 hours she would legally belong to this man who was either very good at pretending heterosexuality or completely different from what she'd assumed. The way he'd touched her hand, the intensity of his attention when he looked at her, the subtle signs of attraction she kept thinking she detected, none of it fit with her theory about his sexual orientation. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the arranged marriage had nothing to do with closeted homosexuality and everything to do with a man who was too busy building an empire to waste time on traditional courtship. Maybe Min Jae simply wanted a wife who understood that their relationship was a business transaction rather than a romantic entanglement, someone who wouldn't make emotional demands that interfered with his professional priorities. "Do you have any other questions about the arrangement?" he asked, returning to his seat behind the massive desk. "What happens if one of us wants to end the partnership?" Min Jae's expression became unreadable, his dark eyes studying her face with renewed intensity. "Are you already considering an exit strategy, Kira?" "I just want to understand all my options," she said, though that wasn't entirely true. What she really wanted to understand was whether Min Jae was as unaffected by her presence as he pretended to be, and whether the growing attraction she felt was going to become a problem if it remained completely one-sided. "The marriage contract includes provisions for dissolution after a minimum term of 3 years," he said. "If either party chooses to terminate the arrangement at that time, you'll receive a substantial settlement that ensures your continued financial security. Before 3 years, termination would require mutual agreement and negotiation of appropriate compensation. So I'm committed for at least 3 years." "We're both committed for at least 3 years," he corrected. "This partnership only works if we're both invested in its success." Kira looked down at the diamond on her finger, then back at the man who would become her husband in 2 days. He was offering her everything she'd dreamed of: financial security, protection for her mother, escape from the violence that had defined her recent life. All she had to do was play the role of devoted wife to a man who probably didn't desire her, but who treated her with more respect and consideration than anyone had in years. It should have been an easy decision. It was an easy decision. "I accept your offer," she said. Min Jae smiled for the first time since she'd met him, a genuine expression of satisfaction that transformed his entire face and made her realize that he was even more dangerously attractive than she'd initially thought. "Welcome to the Kim family, Mrs. Kim," he said, and something about the way he said her new name made her suspect that the next 3 years were going to be far more complicated than either of them was admitting. 3 weeks into married life, Kira was beginning to understand that everything she thought she knew about Kim Min Jae was probably wrong, starting with her assumption that living with him would feel like sharing space with a politely disinterested roommate. The wedding had been a small affair, held in the family's private garden with only immediate relatives present, conducted in both Korean and English by a minister who clearly owed the Kim family significant favors. Min Jae had been formally attentive throughout the ceremony, holding her hand during the vows and kissing her cheek afterward with the kind of restrained affection appropriate for a business arrangement. But when they'd posed for photographs, his arm around her waist had felt possessive rather than perfunctory, and she'd caught him watching her with an intensity that seemed far too personal for someone who was supposed to be indifferent to her appeal. Now, padding through their shared living space in bare feet, and one of the silk robes that had appeared in her closet along with an entire wardrobe of designer clothes she'd never asked for, Kira was forced to confront the growing evidence that her husband was not what she'd expected in any respect. The penthouse they shared occupied the top 2 floors of the family compound, designed as a private residence within the larger estate. It was sophisticated and masculine without being cold, all clean lines and expensive materials arranged with the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money and excellent taste. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Seoul's skyline, while carefully chosen artwork and furniture created spaces that felt both luxurious and surprisingly livable. What she hadn't expected was how domestic Min Jae turned out to be when he was home and relaxed. This morning, like most mornings when he wasn't traveling, she'd found him in the kitchen preparing breakfast with the focused attention he brought to everything else. Not just coffee and toast, but proper Korean banchan alongside perfectly scrambled eggs and fresh fruit arranged with the precision of a restaurant presentation. "You don't have to cook for me," she'd said the first time, embarrassed that her new husband was waiting on her like hired help. "I enjoy cooking," he'd replied, setting down a plate of food that looked too beautiful to eat. "Besides, Mrs. Choi handles the household meals, but breakfast is private time. I prefer to manage it myself." The coffee he made was better than anything she'd had in her life, rich and complex with a subtle sweetness that suggested expensive beans and considerable skill with the elaborate espresso machine that dominated one corner of the kitchen. When she'd complimented it, Min Jae had smiled with genuine pleasure and explained that he'd learned to appreciate good coffee during business school in Switzerland, where he'd apparently spent 2 years perfecting his English and studying international finance. Everything about their morning routine suggested a man who valued control and precision, but also someone who took quiet satisfaction in creating comfort for the people under his protection. He remembered that she preferred her eggs slightly runny, that she liked honey in her tea, that she ate toast in small pieces rather than taking large bites. Details that most people wouldn't notice, stored away and acted upon with the kind of thoughtful attention that felt far more intimate than anything she'd experienced in her previous relationships. The problem was that she was starting to look forward to those morning moments more than was probably wise. Sitting across from Min Jae at the granite breakfast bar while Seoul woke up beyond the windows, discussing everything from Korean politics to American television shows, felt dangerously close to the kind of domestic intimacy she'd convinced herself she didn't want from this arrangement. Especially when he laughed at something she said, which transformed his entire face and made her realize that beneath all the controlled authority was someone who was genuinely funny and surprisingly easy to talk to. Those moments made it increasingly difficult to remember that he was supposed to be gay and unavailable, rather than the most attractive man she'd ever lived with. The other thing that was becoming impossible to ignore was the constant presence of security personnel who managed to be simultaneously invisible and omnipresent. She'd learned to recognize the men who rotated through 12-hour shifts, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits that didn't quite hide the bulk of concealed weapons. They spoke to Min Jae with the kind of professional deference that suggested military or police backgrounds, and when they looked at her, it was with the assessing attention of people whose job was threat evaluation. Mr. Park, who doubled as both driver and security coordinator, had explained the protocols during her first week. Mrs. Kim, you are never to leave the compound without escort, and never to deviate from planned routes without prior approval. These precautions are necessary given Mr. Kim's business profile and the security concerns that come with his level of success. Business profile seemed like careful terminology for something that required armed guards and bulletproof cars, but Kira was beginning to understand that direct questions about Min Jae's work were unlikely to produce straight answers. Instead, she was learning to piece together information from observation and casual comments that revealed far more than their speakers probably intended. Like yesterday afternoon, when she'd been reading in the living room and overheard Min Jae on the phone in his office, speaking rapid Korean with the kind of cold authority that made her spine straighten even though she couldn't understand the words. The tone was unmistakably that of someone giving orders that would be obeyed without question, and when she'd glanced through the partially open door, his body language had been sharp with controlled aggression. After he'd ended the call, she'd asked if everything was all right, and he'd smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes while assuring her that it was just routine business with shipping schedules. But she'd noticed the way his jaw remained tight for the rest of the evening, and the way additional security personnel had appeared around the compound without explanation. The shipping business explanation was becoming increasingly difficult to believe, especially when she'd accidentally walked into his dressing room while he was getting ready for what he'd described as a client dinner. The suit hanging on the valet was beautiful, clearly custom-made, and probably worth more than most people's cars. But beneath the jacket, she'd glimpsed a shoulder holster with what was unmistakably a gun nestled against the expensive silk lining. Their eyes had met in the mirror, and for a moment neither of them had moved. Min Jae's expression had been unreadable, while Kira had tried to process the implications of her husband casually arming himself for business meetings. Some clients require additional security precautions, he'd said finally, adjusting his tie with steady hands. Nothing for you to worry about. But she was worrying, both about what kind of business required weapons and about the growing complexity of her feelings for a man who was supposed to be a convenient stranger. The more time she spent with Min Jae, the more she found herself attracted not just to his obvious physical appeal, but to his intelligence, his unexpected gentleness, and the glimpses of dry humor that emerged when he was relaxed, which made last night's conversation even more confusing and significant. They'd been sharing a late dinner, one of the comfortable meals that had become routine when Min Jae was home and not dealing with whatever crisis required his armed attention. The wine had been exceptional, something from his personal collection that probably cost more than Kira's former monthly salary, and the conversation had meandered from books to travel to family histories. My father built the foundation of our current operations, Min Jae had said, refilling her glass with the careful precision he brought to everything. But he made the mistake of trusting people who ultimately betrayed that trust for their own profit. What happened to him? Kira had asked, though she'd sensed she was approaching dangerous territory. Min Jae had been quiet for a long moment, staring out the windows at Seoul's glittering lights. He was murdered when I was 22, just finishing my degree at Stanford. Shot 3 times in his own office by men he'd considered partners and friends. The pain in his voice had been carefully controlled but unmistakable, and Kira had felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy for the young man who'd lost his father to violence and betrayal. I'm so sorry, she'd said. That must have been devastating. It was educational, he'd replied with the kind of cold detachment that suggested years of practice at suppressing emotional responses. I learned that power without the ability to defend it is just an invitation for others to take what you've built. I also learned that trust is a luxury that can get you killed if you're not careful about who deserves it. The conversation had shifted to safer topics after that, but Kira had been left with the uncomfortable realization that her husband's careful control and constant security weren't paranoia, but practical responses to a world where violence was always a possibility. Whatever business Min Jae was really in, it was dangerous enough that people got murdered for making the wrong decisions or trusting the wrong partners. That understanding made this morning's phone call all the more unsettling. She'd been in the kitchen making her second cup of coffee when her phone had rung, the caller ID showing a number she recognized as belonging to her best friend Shanice back in Detroit. "Girl, you need to be careful," Shanice had said without preamble. "That crazy-ass stepfather of yours has been asking questions about where you went and how to contact you. He showed up at my apartment last night, drunk as hell, talking about how you can't just disappear without consequences and how your Korean husband needs to understand that you have obligations back home." Kira's blood had turned cold. Marcus was supposed to be out of her life permanently, a problem solved by distance and her new husband's resources. The idea that he was still trying to assert control over her decisions felt like a direct threat to the safety she'd thought she'd finally achieved. "What did you tell him?" she'd asked. "Nothing, because I don't know nothing," Shanice had replied. "But he's got some kind of lawyer now, talking about how you can't just abandon family responsibilities and how international marriages don't protect people from their legal obligations." It sounded like bullshit to me, but he seemed pretty confident about whatever game he's trying to play. Kira had ended the call feeling sick with anxiety and anger. Even 6,000 miles away, Marcus was still trying to control and manipulate her, still unwilling to accept that she'd found a way to escape his influence. She'd been sitting at the breakfast bar trying to figure out how to handle the situation when Min Jae had emerged from his morning shower, dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the way water still dampened the edges of his perfectly styled hair. "You look upset," he'd said, settling onto the stool beside her with the kind of focused attention that suggested whatever had been occupying his morning thoughts was now secondary to her obvious distress. "My stepfather is apparently trying to cause trouble," she'd explained, outlining Shanice's warning and her own concerns about what Marcus might be planning. Min Jae had listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively colder as she described Marcus's threats and implications about legal obligations. When she finished, he'd been quiet for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on her face with the kind of intensity that made her feel like he was calculating options and potential responses. "Give me his full name and last known address," he'd said finally. "Why?" "Because problems like your stepfather require permanent solutions, and I have considerably more resources for implementing those solutions than he realizes." The calm certainty in Min Jae's voice had sent a chill down her spine that was part fear and part something that felt uncomfortably like gratitude. This was the voice she'd heard on those Korean phone calls, cold and authoritative and absolutely confident in its ability to eliminate obstacles. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," she'd said carefully. "No one will get hurt who doesn't deserve it," Min Jae had replied, already reaching for his own phone. "But your stepfather's harassment ends today." He'd made a single call, speaking in rapid Korean for less than 2 minutes before hanging up and returning his attention to her with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested the problem was already being resolved. "What did you just do?" Kira had asked. "I arranged for Mr. Washington to receive some information about the consequences of continuing to interfere with my wife's peace of mind. He'll also discover that any legal action he might be considering would be both expensive and unsuccessful, and that his current living situation depends on maintaining good relationships with people who value discretion and respect for boundaries." 24 hours later, Shanice had called to report that Marcus had suddenly developed a complete lack of interest in Kira's whereabouts and had, in fact, mentioned to several people that he wished her well in her new life and hoped they'd both learn from past mistakes. The speed and efficiency with which Min Jae had neutralized a problem that had seemed intractable left Kira with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Her husband clearly had access to resources and influence that extended far beyond legitimate business operations, and he was willing to use those resources to protect her without being asked and without expecting anything in return. That protective instinct, combined with the growing evidence of his attraction and the domestic intimacy of their daily routine, was making it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that this was a purely business arrangement between two people with no romantic interest in each other. Especially when she'd caught him watching her this morning while she read the newspaper, his dark eyes following the movement of her hands and lingering on her mouth in a way that seemed far too personal for a gay man who'd married her for convenience. Maybe it was time to admit that her assumptions about Kim Min-jae had been completely wrong, and that the most dangerous thing about her current situation wasn't his criminal connections or armed security, but the growing possibility that she was falling in love with a husband who might actually be capable of loving her back. The first sign that something was wrong came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night when the compound's security lights flickered once and then went completely dark, plunging the estate into a blackness that felt deliberately engineered rather than accidental. Kira had been reading in the living room, enjoying the rare quiet evening, while Min-jae attended what he described as a late dinner with shipping partners from Busan. She'd grown comfortable with his business trips, had even started looking forward to the solitude and the chance to video call her mother without worrying about accidentally revealing details about their unconventional arrangement. But when the lights cut out and the subtle hum of the security system died into silence, every instinct screamed danger. She reached for her phone, grateful for the illumination from its screen as she tried to call Min-jae. The call went straight to voicemail, which had never happened before. Min-jae's phone was always on, always answered within 2 rings, because his business apparently required constant availability for emergencies and urgent decisions. The sound of breaking glass from somewhere downstairs made her blood freeze. Not the accidental crash of something falling, but the deliberate shattering of a window or door being forced open by someone who didn't care about stealth anymore. Kira's hands shook as she dialed the emergency contact number Mr. Park had made her memorize during her first week. Before the call could connect, she heard voices speaking rapid Korean, multiple men moving through the house with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested military or professional training. They weren't burglars. Burglars would have fled the moment they triggered the security system. These men had disabled the security system and were now searching the house with a specific purpose in mind. She crept toward the bedroom, staying low and trying to remember the escape protocols Mr. Park had outlined, but that she'd never imagined actually needing. The master suite had a reinforced safe room behind the walk-in closet, equipped with independent communication systems and enough supplies to last for hours until help arrived. But before she could reach the bedroom, she heard footsteps on the main staircase, accompanied by voices that were getting closer and more distinct. Her Korean was limited, but she caught enough words to understand that they were looking for someone specific. They were looking for her. The realization hit like a physical blow. This wasn't a random break-in or a burglary gone wrong. This was a targeted operation, and she was the target. Kira Duck walked into the master bathroom, closing the door as silently as possible and locking it with hands that trembled so badly she could barely manipulate the mechanism. The bathroom had a small window that overlooked the garden, but they were on the 2nd floor, and she had no way to climb down even if she could fit through the opening. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from unknown numbers and a text message from Min-jae that made her heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. Under attack. Stay hidden until I arrive. Do not engage. Help is coming. The timestamp showed he'd sent the message 7 minutes ago, which meant he knew what was happening and was presumably racing back to handle the situation. But 7 minutes might as well have been 7 hours if the men searching the house found her first. The bathroom door handle rattled as someone tested it from the outside. Kira pressed herself into the corner behind the oversized bathtub, trying to make herself as small as possible while clutching her phone like a lifeline. A voice spoke in accented English, close enough that the speaker had to be standing directly outside the door. "Mrs. Kim, we know you are in there. We are not here to hurt you, only to deliver a message to your husband about territorial agreements and respectful business practices." The reasonable tone was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. These men weren't acting out of passion or desperation. They were professionals executing a plan that involved using her as leverage against Min-jae, and their calm competence suggested they'd done this kind of thing before. "Your husband has been expanding his operations into areas that belong to other families," the voice continued. "This creates problems that must be resolved through negotiation rather than continued encroachment. You will help us communicate the importance of these discussions." The door handle rattled again, more aggressively this time, and Kira heard what sounded like tools being deployed to defeat the lock. They weren't going to wait for her cooperation much longer. She tried calling Min Jae again, and this time the phone rang once before his voice cut through with sharp authority. Where are you? Master bathroom. Locked in, but they're about to break down the door. How many? I heard at least 3 voices, maybe more downstairs. Stay exactly where you are and get as low as possible. Do not move until I tell you it's safe. The line went dead just as the bathroom doors splintered inward with a crash that echoed through the penthouse like gunfire. 2 men in dark tactical gear stepped through the ruined doorway, their movements coordinated and professional as they swept the room with weapons drawn. The first man was older, probably in his 40s, with the kind of scarred hands and alert posture that suggested extensive experience with violence. The second was younger but equally dangerous looking, carrying equipment that included zip ties and what looked like a small medical kit. Mrs. Kim, the older man said, lowering his weapon but keeping it ready. Please stand up slowly and keep your hands where we can see them. We have no desire to hurt you, but we need your cooperation to resolve a business dispute with your husband. Kira remained crouched behind the bathtub, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. Every self-defense class she'd ever taken had emphasized that cooperating with kidnappers dramatically decreased your chances of survival, especially if you were being taken to a secondary location. The younger man moved toward her hiding spot, speaking in Korean to his partner with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested they were operating on a timeline. That's when the lights in the compound blazed back to life with the sudden brilliance of a stage production, accompanied by the distinctive whine of multiple helicopters approaching at high speed. Both intruders froze, their professional composure cracking as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. The older man spoke rapidly into a radio device, his voice tight with what might have been fear. The response came through his earpiece loud enough for Kira to hear, a stream of panicked Korean that made both men exchange looks of genuine alarm. Mrs. Kim, the older man said, his tone shifting from confident to urgent. Your husband has arrived with significant reinforcement. We are going to leave now, and you are going to remain exactly where you are until this building is secured. They moved toward the broken doorway with the kind of speed that suggested retreat was now their primary objective. But before they could reach the corridor, the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from somewhere in the house, sharp bursts of gunfire that seemed to be moving systematically from room to room. The older intruder pressed himself against the wall beside the doorway, speaking into his radio with the controlled desperation of someone trying to coordinate an escape under fire. The response was immediate and clearly not what he wanted to hear, because he cursed in Korean and motioned for his partner to follow him toward the window. They were planning to rappel down to the garden rather than try to escape through a house that was apparently being cleared by Min Jae's security forces with lethal efficiency. The younger man had just started rigging a rope to the window frame when Kim Min Jae stepped through the bathroom doorway. Kira had never seen her husband like this. Gone was the controlled businessman who made perfect coffee and discussed international shipping routes over breakfast. This was someone entirely different, someone who moved with predatory grace and held a gun with the casual expertise of professional violence. His expensive suit was rumpled and stained with something dark, his perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his dark eyes held the kind of cold fury that made her understand why people might choose to fear rather than cross him. Gentlemen, he said in English, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made both intruders freeze with their hands still on their weapons. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The older man started to raise his gun, probably intending to use Kira as a human shield, but Min Jae moved faster than seemed possible for someone his size. 2 shots, fired with surgical precision, and both intruders dropped to the bathroom floor without having the chance to return fire. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Kira's ragged breathing and the distant noise of helicopters landing in the compound's courtyard. Min Jae holstered his weapon and crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside the bathtub where Kira was still crouched in terrified paralysis. Are you hurt? He asked, his hands moving over her face and arms with gentle efficiency, checking for injuries while his eyes remained sharp with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was still processing potential threats. I'm okay, she managed, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. They said they wanted to send you a message about territorial disputes. Min Jae's expression darkened further, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of someone making strategic decisions about how to eliminate problems permanently. The Choi Syndicate has been trying to expand into shipping routes that have belonged to my family for 15 years, he said, helping her stand on legs that felt too shaky to support her weight. Tonight was their attempt to pressure me into negotiations by threatening what they perceived as my weakness. He guided her carefully around the bodies on the bathroom floor, his arm around her waist providing both physical support and emotional reassurance as they moved into the bedroom, where the sound of multiple voices speaking Korean suggested that his security team was securing the rest of the house. Your weakness, Kira repeated, trying to process the implications of what he'd said. They thought you'd negotiate to protect me. Min Jae paused in the doorway, turning to face her with an expression that was part anger and part something that looked uncomfortably like vulnerability. They were right, he said. I would have given them anything they demanded to ensure your safety, which is why they will never have the opportunity to threaten you again. The simple statement hit her with the force of revelation. This wasn't the response of a gay man protecting a convenient business partner. This was the reaction of someone whose feelings were far deeper and more dangerous than either of them had been willing to acknowledge. Min Jae, she said carefully, what exactly is your business? He studied her face for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth she could handle in the aftermath of armed men breaking into their home and him killing them with the efficiency of a professional assassin. I'm the head of the Kim family operations in Seoul, he said finally. We control shipping, import and export licensing, port security, and territorial agreements throughout South Korea and extending into major Chinese and Japanese markets. We also handle conflict resolution and business arbitration for organizations that prefer to avoid government involvement in their disputes. Criminal organizations, Kira said. You're talking about criminal organizations. I'm talking about business that operates outside conventional legal frameworks, but serves essential economic functions that legitimate corporations can't or won't address. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise what he was telling her. Her husband was a crime boss, the head of what amounted to a Korean mafia family, and the man she'd been living with for 6 weeks was someone who killed people as part of his regular business operations. And tonight, he'd killed 2 men to protect her without hesitation or apparent regret. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because I wanted you to have the choice to leave before you understood what accepting my protection really meant, he said. And because I was trying to convince myself that I could keep this marriage as a business arrangement without involving you in the realities of my world. Past tense, Kira noted. Was trying. Min Jae moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his dark eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. The business arrangement ended the moment I saw you, he said. Everything I told you about no physical expectations and maintaining emotional distance was a lie I told myself because I couldn't admit that I wanted you from the first day and that wanting you was going to make me vulnerable in ways that could get us both killed. Kira stared at him, trying to reconcile this confession with everything she believed about his sexual orientation and his reasons for marrying her. But you're gay, she said weakly. Min Jae's laugh was sharp with bitter amusement. I've never been attracted to men in my life. I avoided relationships because emotional attachments create leverage that enemies can use against you, and because the women who were interested in me were usually more interested in the money and status than the person. You were supposed to be safe because you didn't want anything from me except security for your family. Except you changed that, he continued, his voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper. You made me want things I'd convinced myself I could live without. A wife who laughed at my jokes and looked forward to breakfast together and made me feel like maybe I could be something more than just another criminal who inherited his father's empire. The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other over the past 6 weeks. You're mine, Min Jae said, the words carrying absolute conviction. That stopped being pretense the moment you walked into this house, and tonight proved that I'm willing to go to war to keep what belongs to me. The question is whether you can accept the man I actually am rather than the fiction we've been maintaining. Kira looked at her husband, really looked at him, seeing the dangerous competence and controlled violence and genuine emotion that she'd been too blinded by her own assumptions to recognize. He was offering her honesty that was both terrifying and liberating, the chance to build something real with someone who'd just proven he would kill to protect her. "I never thought you were gay," she said quietly. "I hoped you were gay because it seemed safer than admitting I was falling in love with someone who could break my heart or get me killed." Min Jae stepped closer, close enough to cup her face in hands that still smelled like gunpowder and expensive cologne. "I can't promise you won't get hurt," he said. "My world is dangerous and my enemies will always see you as a way to reach me. But I can promise that anyone who tries to hurt you will discover that crossing the Kim family has permanent consequences." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been holding back for weeks and had finally run out of reasons to maintain control. Kira kissed him back with equal desperation, tasting danger and possibility and the beginning of something that was going to change everything about the careful balance they'd maintained. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Min Jae rested his forehead against hers with the kind of vulnerable intimacy she'd never expected from the controlled businessman she'd married. "So what now?" she asked. "Now you decide if you can love a criminal," he said. "And I figure out how to keep you safe in a world where showing weakness gets you killed, and you've become my greatest weakness and my greatest strength." "I can love a criminal," Kira said, surprising herself with how easily the admission came. "But I need you to promise me no more lies about who you are or what you do." "No more lies," Min Jae agreed. "Starting with this, I'm completely, obsessively in love with my wife, and everyone who might threaten that is about to discover why my family has controlled Seoul for 3 generations." For the first time since she'd accepted his proposal, Kira felt like she was seeing the real Kim Min Jae, and she discovered that the dangerous truth was infinitely more appealing than the safe fiction they'd been living. The morning after the attack found them in Min Jae's office, where the first light of dawn was filtering through bulletproof windows that Kira hadn't known were bulletproof until 12 hours ago. She was curled in one of the leather chairs wearing one of his dress shirts over her pajamas, while he sat behind his granite desk fielding phone calls in rapid Korean with the efficient authority of someone coordinating the aftermath of a war. Neither of them had slept. After the security team had finished securing the compound and removing all evidence that violence had occurred in their home, they'd spent hours talking with the kind of raw honesty that felt both liberating and terrifying. Min Jae had explained the territorial dispute with the Choi Syndicate, the business decisions that had led to the escalation, and the permanent resolution that was currently being implemented by his associates throughout Seoul. By sunrise, the Choi organization would no longer exist as a functioning criminal enterprise, its leadership eliminated and its remaining members absorbed into other families or relocated to cities where they posed no future threat to Kim operations. The efficiency was breathtaking and horrible and somehow comforting all at once. "So this is your real life," Kira said when Min Jae finished his latest call and returned his attention to her with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had his complete attention despite the crisis management he'd been coordinating. "This is my real life," he confirmed. "Strategic planning, territorial management, conflict resolution, and the occasional elimination of problems that can't be solved through negotiation, along with legitimate shipping operations, real estate development, and investment portfolios that generate enough legal income to justify our lifestyle and provide cover for the less conventional revenue streams." He moved around the desk to sit in the chair beside hers, close enough to take her hand in both of his. The contact was warm and reassuring, but she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that suggested the adrenaline hadn't completely faded. "I understand if you need time to process everything," he said. "Last night was a lot to absorb, and I know the reality of what I do is different from whatever you might have imagined when you agreed to marry me." Kira studied his face, noting the exhaustion around his dark eyes and the tension in his jaw that suggested he was preparing for her to reject everything they discovered about each other in the past few hours. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. When you said no physical expectations in our marriage contract, what were you really protecting us from?" Min Jae was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles across her knuckles with the kind of absent tenderness that suggested the gesture was becoming automatic. "I was protecting you from getting involved with someone whose world includes violence and danger as routine occupational hazards," he said finally. And I was protecting myself from caring about someone so much that losing them would destroy my ability to make the kind of ruthless decisions that keep my family and organization alive. But you were already attracted to me. From the moment I saw you, he admitted. You walked into our house looking brave and terrified and determined to save your mother no matter what it cost you. And I realized I was in serious trouble. Everything about you was exactly what I'd been telling myself I didn't want and couldn't afford. What changed your mind about keeping your distance? You did, Min Jae said simply. Every morning when you laughed at something I said over breakfast. Every time you asked thoughtful questions about Korean culture or my family history. Every time you fell asleep reading on the couch and I had to carry you to bed, trying to pretend that holding you didn't feel like the most natural thing in the world. The admission made her heart clench with a mixture of regret and possibility. They'd wasted weeks dancing around feelings that had apparently been mutual from the beginning, both of them too afraid of complicating their careful arrangement to acknowledge what was really happening between them. I thought you were gay, she said. For the longest time, I convinced myself that was why the marriage felt safe. I could live with someone attractive and kind and intelligent without worrying about getting my heart broken because he could never want me back. Min Jae's laugh was soft with amusement and something that might have been relief. I spent 6 weeks trying to convince myself that a beautiful, intelligent woman who made me want to be a better man was just a business partner I happened to find personally appealing. We were both working very hard to avoid the obvious. So what happens now? Kira asked. Do we renegotiate our contract? We tear up the contract, Min Jae said without hesitation. What I'm offering you now isn't a business arrangement with financial compensation and defined termination clauses. What I'm offering you is marriage to a man who is completely in love with his wife and who wants to build a life together that's real in every way that matters. He stood and walked to his safe, returning with the folder containing their original agreement. Without ceremony, he fed the papers into the document shredder beside his desk, reducing months of careful legal language to ribbons of paper that fluttered into the wastebasket. No more contracts, he said. No more predetermined timelines or exit strategies or emotional distance. Just me asking if you want to stay married to someone whose business involves criminal activities and whose enemies will always see you as a potential target. Kira looked at her husband, really seeing him for the first time since she'd walked into his world 6 weeks ago. The dangerous competence that had terrified her last night now felt like the ultimate security, proof that he had the resources and ruthlessness to protect what belonged to him. The criminal empire that should have been morally objectionable seemed less important than the man who'd built his entire life around loyalty and protecting the people he cared about. Yes, she said, I want to stay married to you. Not the fiction we created, but the real you, including the dangerous parts. Min Jae's smile was brilliant with relief and satisfaction and something that looked like wonder, as if he hadn't quite believed she would choose him once she understood what that choice really meant. In that case, Mrs. Kim, he said, moving close enough to frame her face with his hands, I should probably mention that I've already made arrangements for your mother's transfer to Seoul. There's a private medical facility here that's better equipped than anything available in Los Angeles, and I want my family close enough that I can ensure their protection personally. You want to bring my mother here? I want to bring your mother here, he confirmed, along with making arrangements for you to continue your education if that's something you're interested in, and ensuring that you understand your role in the family business extends far beyond playing the devoted wife at social functions. What kind of role? Min Jae settled back into his chair, pulling her with him until she was curled in his lap with her head against his shoulder. The position felt natural and safe, like something they'd been doing for years rather than minutes. The kind of role that involves using your intelligence and instincts to help me make better decisions about people and situations, he said. The kind of role that means you're not just under my protection, but actively participating in protecting our interests and our people. The kind of role that makes you my partner in every sense of the word. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Kira had spent her entire adult life working jobs where she followed other people's instructions and accepted other people's decisions about her future. Min Jae was offering her the chance to be actively involved in building something significant, even if that something operated outside conventional legal boundaries. I'd like that, she said. Being your partner, I mean. Real partners. Real partners, he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Starting with this. I love you, and not just because you're brave or beautiful, but because you make excellent coffee. I love you because you see the best in people even when they've given you plenty of reasons not to, and because you have the strength to choose love even when it's complicated and dangerous. I love you too, Kira said, and felt something that had been twisted with anxiety and uncertainty for weeks finally relax into certainty. I love the man who makes me breakfast every morning and remembers how I like my coffee, and who killed 2 people last night to keep me safe. The words should have sounded wrong, but they didn't. They sounded like truth, like acceptance of all the different facets that made Min Jae who he was. Her phone rang, interrupting the moment with a familiar ringtone that meant her mother was calling from Detroit. Kira glanced at Min Jae, who nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, he said. She should know that her daughter is officially part of a Korean crime family now, and that she'll be receiving better medical care than she ever imagined possible. Kira answered the call, settling more comfortably in her husband's lap, while he traced absent patterns on her arm with fingers that were gentle now, but had been lethal just hours earlier. Mom, she said, I have some things to tell you about my new life, and I think you're going to be surprised by how much everything has changed. The conversation lasted an hour, with Kira explaining everything from the attack to the revelation about Min Jae's business to the arrangements being made for her mother's transfer to Seoul. Min Jae contributed details about the medical facility and the timeline for relocation, speaking to her mother with the same respectful formality he used for important business negotiations. When they finally ended the call, her mother had expressed a mixture of concern about the danger and excitement about the opportunity to be closer to her daughter and receive treatment that might actually cure rather than just manage her condition. She likes you, Kira told Min Jae. She said you sound like a man who takes his responsibilities seriously and that she's grateful her daughter found someone willing to fight for her. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, he replied. I'm looking forward to meeting her properly and ensuring she understands that she's not gaining a son-in-law, but a son who happens to run a criminal organization. They were interrupted by a knock on the office door, followed by the entry of Mr. Park with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested good news. Sir, he said in English, presumably for Kira's benefit, the Choi situation has been fully resolved. Their remaining assets have been absorbed or redistributed, and their former territory is now under our direct management. There will be no further threats from that organization. Excellent, Min Jae said. And the cleanup from last night? Complete. No evidence remains, and the official report will show a home invasion interrupted by security forces that resulted in the deaths of 2 unidentified intruders. No connection to broader organizational conflicts. Thank you, Mr. Park. Please ensure that all personnel understand Mrs. Kim's new status within the family hierarchy and arrange for additional security protocols given recent events. Of course, sir. After Mr. Park left, Min Jae turned his attention back to Kira with the kind of focused intensity that suggested they had more important things to discuss than crisis management and territorial consolidation. So he said, we've established that we love each other and that you're willing to be married to a criminal. We've arranged for your mother's care and your education and your role in the family business. Is there anything else we need to address about our new arrangement? Just one thing, Kira said, leaning forward to kiss him with the confidence of someone who finally understood exactly what she was choosing. When do we start the real honeymoon? Min Jae's answering smile was brilliant with promise and possibility and the kind of dangerous charm that suggested their real honeymoon was going to be far more interesting than anything they could have imagined 6 weeks ago. Right now, he said, standing with her still in his arms. Starting with me showing my wife exactly how much I've been wanting her since the day she walked into my life, and made me realize that the most dangerous thing I could do was fall in love. As he carried her toward their bedroom, Kira reflected on how completely wrong her original assumptions had been. She'd thought she was marrying a gay man for convenience and security. Instead, she'd found herself married to a dangerously attractive criminal who was completely devoted to her, and whose love felt like the safest and most thrilling thing she'd ever experienced. Sometimes, she thought as Min Jae kicked the bedroom door closed behind them, the best plans were the ones that fell apart completely and revealed something infinitely better than what you'd originally hoped for.